Hi there, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third in our series of subcontractor compliance webinars. The topic of the day is going to be small business program and the requirements that go under those programs. The couple of logistics things first. If those of you that are attending from outside of the company are subcontractors and prospective subcontractors, you should see a Q&A slide if you're interested in a copy of the slides or the presentation after the fact. Please provide us with your name, your company, and your email, and we'll make sure and get those out to you afterwards. So whether you're attending from, if you're an ECC employee or an ECC subcontractor, thank you for taking the time to be here. We're going to spend about an hour talking about small business program requirements under our federal government contracts. And as always, if you have questions, please do submit them in the panel to your left, and I will do my best to take care of all the questions towards the end of today's webinar. So one of the things that we're going to go through, and if this is new to you, it's going to be a little bit confusing, is that I mean, all within the government, you know, we love our acronyms, but in probably no place more than in the small business arena. So there are going to be a handful of things that I will go through pretty quickly, and I will throw around a lot of acronyms, as you see there from the first bullet point. I'll explain what each of these are. Some of them may be more familiar to you than others. But again, if you have questions, please enter those questions and let us know. I will do my best to try and walk through them slowly and just make sure that I'm not completely speaking Greek. And that we're able to follow, you know, the point of the presentation, even if I am using acronyms that you're not familiar with. So really that, you know, in and of itself is kind of one of the basic points of the training, is to make sure that we do have an understanding of the acronyms, what programs are out there, what do these things mean, what's the purpose of them, why does the government do them. Third bullet point, we're going to try and understand, you know, how does that impact ECC? As a company in terms of our acquisition strategy vis-a-vis the government, and how does it impact our acquisition strategy and our flexibility in terms of things that we can do in terms of subcontractors. Thirdly, also, you know, what do our subcontractors have to do? Because our large business subcontractors have a lot of the same requirements that we have through flow downs, and then we become responsible for making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, collecting their data and their reports, and making sure that they're also carrying out their small business programs, even though they're at a level of a subcontract beneath us. And the last thing is just to understand kind of what are the constraints and obligations. I've kind of already teased it there a little bit. There are some reporting requirements, there are goals and targets, there are penalties for failing to meet those, and we'll talk about all of those. Okay. So the first test here is, I think, to go through some of that alphabet soup that we saw in the prior slide, and that is just to talk about what are the various different types of small businesses that we're going to talk about. So I will discuss what constitutes a small business in general, right? And so if we break the universe into two categories of businesses, small and large, depending on what industry you're in and what type of work you're doing, there will be a what we call a NAICS code, which we'll talk about in a bit, and that is basically going to be a revenue or an employee headcount size standard, and that will determine whether you are a small or a large business for the type of work that you're doing. A lot of businesses, us included, might be small in some NAICS codes and large in others, and we see that pretty typically depending on the type of, you know, different types of services that you offer. If you are small within a given NAICS code, you may also then fall into what I refer to as these kind of small business subcategories. And so that's really what is listed here from the second bullet on downwards. So those subcategories include small disadvantaged businesses, women-owned businesses, HUBZone businesses, veteran and service disabled veteran-owned businesses, HBCU MIs, which we'll talk about very briefly, 8A businesses, and then the trifecta down at the bottom, Indian-owned, Native Hawaiian-owned, and Alaska Native corporations. We'll talk about kind of what are the different benefits and obligations that come with each of these different types of subcategories. So the next thing we'll talk about is kind of why do these things exist? And basically, you know, these don't necessarily impact the quality of work or the type of goods or services that the government's buying. If you walk into a building, you can't really tell if it was, constructed by a Hispanic-owned company or a veteran-owned company. The building should meet the specs, period, regardless of who built it. So the government's not looking at these clauses in terms of the work that they're actually buying, but what they're looking at is kind of these secondary effects on the economy and on certain classes of people that can be brought to bear in terms of the government putting these clauses into our contracts and enforcing them at our level and at lower tier subcontractor levels. So the first thing it is basically designed to promote economic growth in areas that otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity. Small business, as a rule, is very, very important for a variety of reasons. One, it brings a lot of new technology to market. The existence of small businesses in the marketplace helps keep costs down. If we didn't have small business programs, ultimately, a lot of markets would ultimately roll into 2 or 3, semi-monopolistic companies, and that's a good way to have no technological innovation and very little price pressure. So the existence of small businesses and programs that give small businesses additional opportunities helps those small businesses infuse the market with additional cost competition, as well as small businesses frequently bring new ideas and technology into the market that large businesses just aren't focused on because they don't have to be in a lot of cases. So first bullet point there, they're designed to promote economic growth in areas that wouldn't otherwise have those opportunities. There are also some clauses that we won't talk about a lot today, but there are other socioeconomic clauses that are designed not at the business level, but the individual level to provide employment opportunities also for these individuals, whereas the small business program is for businesses owned by particular protected class individuals. Okay. So this really kind of recaps that, and I think the first bullet point here is where we're going to spend most of our time. It's the clauses that regard class business rights, and so we'll talk about what are these programs, right? There are small business set-asides, there are sole source areas, and there are competitive set-asides. We'll talk about both of those. There's a law that Congress passed years ago called the Indian Incentive Act, which provides some opportunities and incentives for companies and prime contractors in particular to give money, to give contracts, I should say, subcontracts and subcontract opportunities, specifically to Indian-owned, Alaskan-owned, or Native Hawaiian-owned companies. There are HUBZone classifications, which provide the opportunity for sole source work to companies in those classifications, and we'll talk about what those are, and so forth. So you also see your veteran, service disabled veteran, and then general small business. And as we go through each of these, I'll kind of tell you who gets what or who's eligible for what under the different paradigms. Some companies are eligible for certain treatment if they're looking at acquisition directly from the government, and some types of companies might get certain types of treatment if they're looking for work at a subcontract level when they're looking to work for a subcontractor such as ECC. And a lot of times those don't match up, right? So there's certain things they can get from the government that they can't get from us, and in a couple of situations there are opportunities or programs that they can get from us that they can't get directly from the government. All right. So part of that then leads into this next slide, which is when do we see these programs used? And the short answer is, you see them in the acquisition stage, which is, prior to the government giving out the work, and then you also see them post-acquisition stage, which is after the government has awarded the work to us or to another business, a large business, or another prime contractor. Then there are different programs that will kick in that once the government awards a large scope of work to a large business, it doesn't mean game over for the small businesses of that area. It just means that new programs will now kick in. So some of the categories that we see, some of the things that you see at the acquisition stage, these are things that the government can do to benefit small businesses. And the first one that we routinely see is what we call competitive set-asides. And this might sound a little bit like an oxymoron. Is it competitive or is it a set-aside? And the answer is it's both. Basically what it means is the government may say, we're going to, rather than do this as a full and open or unrestricted procurement, we're going to do it as a competitive set aside for small businesses. So small businesses, you have to compete, you have to turn in a proposal, you have to have a good price. But the good news is you're not going to be competing against the behemoths of the industry. You're only going to be competing against other small businesses. So you have to compete, but you have a better chance of winning than if you had to compete against the big boys, because you're only going to be competing against other companies that are similarly situated to you in terms of size and fitting into the small business classification for the NAICS code for the job at issue. The second type of program or benefit that we see at the acquisition stage is that sometimes the government will do price preferences in their competitive solicitations. So in a situation like this, a hypothetical would be that the government says, I'm not restricting this to only small businesses, anybody can bid, but if a small business bids, we're going to normalize their price by, say, 5 or 10%, and we're going to give them the work, even if they're not the low bidder, as long as they're within that 5 or 10% price band. So we're going to give them a price preference, an adjustment, which is kind of an artificial look at their price. So let's say the number is 5%, and a large business bids $10 million for a scope of work, and the small business bids $10,200,000. Even though they are not the low bidder, in that scenario, the government would give the small business the work anyway at the higher price, based on the inclusion of the price preference clause and the paradigm to try to give small businesses work. And here the trade-off is, yeah, it might be a little bit more money to the taxpayers, but we're going to do it for these other social benefit goals that I talked about earlier, which is to give these businesses the opportunities, try and increase competition, try and minimize monopoly markets and things of that nature. The third bullet point here on this particular slide that the government can do is that they can give sole source awards to certain of the subcategory types of contractors. And the two that we frequently see are HUBZone contractors and 8A contractors. Again, we'll talk about both of those on a go-forward basis. These tend to be restricted in terms of dollar amounts. Right now, the maximum ceiling is $4 million. The government, in certain cases, can also give sole source work to Alaska Native corporations. That has a much higher maximum ceiling, but it's actually much lower than it used to be. That's a program that's getting kind of pared back a little bit. But they can get, depending on the year of funding, they can get sole source work of an order of magnitude higher than this, up towards 20 million or more. And it used to kind of be unlimited, but again, that's one of the few programs that's actually getting a little bit trimmed down rather than expanding. Okay, so once the government has given work to a prime contractor, again, it's not game over for small businesses, but it is a case of you need to look at a different methodology for trying to find opportunities to get a piece of that work. So the government's given the work to a large business contractor. Doesn't mean that small businesses are just out of luck. It now means that the government, that the prime contractor will have a small business subcontracting plan requirement, and they will be required to have goals for small businesses generally, as well as each of the small business subcategories. So as soon as that work is awarded, the large business will have, likely with their proposal, have already submitted a plan that says, if we're awarded this work, we're going to give 40% of our total subcontracting to small businesses, and 5% to women-owned small business WASBs, and 3% to service-disabled veterans, et cetera, et cetera. Then what you have to do is you have to report your results to the government every 6 months. And if you are meeting your goals, that's wonderful. And if you're not meeting your goals, you have to pretty much explain to the government what you're doing in terms of outreach and in terms of corrective action to try and get improvement on those categories where you're not meeting your goals. So it's not automatic that if you get a contract, the first 6 months or first year, you're going to automatically meet all your goals. It's actually a little bit rare and maybe difficult to do that simply because you may not have a broad swath of subcontracting that's going to allow you to hit every target. Usually what we see is in the first year, you're probably going to be far in excess on some of your goals, and you might have zeros on your other goals because you may only have 4 subcontracts total. And so it's hard to get every single subcategory checked off when you're just not doing hundreds and hundreds of subcontracts. Or even if you're counting your vendors and you do have dozens of subcontractor purchasing issues, they may be of small dollars. And so you might be in the 0.5% for some category and 10% for another category. The key thing here, the third bullet point, if you don't meet your goals, the FAR allows the government to assess LDs, which is a dollar for dollar penalty, so very draconian. But they don't do it automatically. And in fact, in 30 years of industry that I've been involved, I've never seen anybody get assessed with LDs. But we do mention it because the FAR allows for it. And basically what it says is if the prime contractor doesn't make a good faith effort, doesn't even try, then they can get assessed dollar for dollar LDs. So what this means is, if you said in your plan, hey, I'm going to give $1 million to small business, and then you only awarded $500,000, and you can't even demonstrate that you tried good faith, so you didn't turn in your reports, you didn't go to outreach events, you didn't do trade fairs, you didn't try and seek out qualified bidders, and the government said, wow, you didn't even make a good faith effort, they could basically fine you $500,000, for lack of a better example. So it's a very, very stiff penalty. For that reason, we tend to see contractors take this very, very seriously because the downside is enormous. Okay. So the other type of socioeconomic clause that we see implemented at the post-award stage, in addition to small business subcontracting plan requirements, is under the Indian Incentive Act. And what the Indian Incentive Act does, and we'll talk about it in some subsequent slides, it actually provides a financial incentive payment of 5% for every dollar that you give to qualified entities. And that'll be Indian, Hawaiian, and Native Alaskan. And I won't get too ahead of myself because we'll talk about that in turn. All right, so when are these programs used? So again, speaking to our own ECC employees listening to this, and then also for the benefit of subcontractors, we are a large business under many NAICS codes, under construction in particular. We are a small business under environmental. So when we are a small business, we don't have to do a small business subcontracting plan. So if you're listening, ECC employees, and you're in an environmental project under NAICS code 562910, you won't have to do a small business subcontracting plan under that project, assuming that it was bid as a small business set aside during a time that we were small under that NAICS code. For most of our work, however, right now, and certainly for all of our construction work, we are much larger than the NAICS code threshold, and therefore we do have to do small business subcontracting plans. In addition, we then have to flow that requirement down to our subcontractors. And so the same test will apply. If our subcontractors are small under the NAICS code, then they don't have to do anything. They don't have to do a small business subcontracting plan. But if our subcontractors are large under the NAICS code at issue, then they also have to do a small business subcontracting plan. And if in a certain situation they then subcontracted further, the same test would apply yet again. Now, the only other caveat to that is that there are dollar thresholds. So on construction projects, it has to be $1.5 million or above. So if I give $1 million subcontract to a large business, they don't have to do anything. But if I give $1.6 million to a large business, they have to do a small business subcontracting plan. That means they have to do semi-annual reports. They have to tell us what they're doing. They have to log into the government website and report their data, et cetera, et cetera. So this is very important, the flow down part of this. A lot of times subcontractors may or may not be aware of the extent of their requirements, particularly if they're new to government work. But our results and how well we enforce this on subcontractors and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing absolutely impacts both our proposal evaluations as well as our CPAR ratings. And it also impacts our CPSR audits when DCMA comes in and looks to see how well we're doing our subcontracting. So there are a lot of tertiary benefits or potential pitfalls if we don't do this correctly. So now we're going to go into the categories, and we're going to talk about what those different categories are. As a preface, I talked a little bit about, small businesses are those that are have revenues or employee counts under the various thresholds. But when you add all that up, most of the businesses in the country are small businesses. It's very much a disproportionate number, simply because, obviously it takes a whole lot of small businesses to equal the number of employees in one gigantic large business. So about 99% of the businesses in the U.S. are small business, and about half of the individuals in the U.S. work for a small business. And so what does that mean? Again, it's measured by either your annual revenue, and that's your annual revenue is tracked over a 3-year period, and that is going to change shortly to a 5-year runway. And I think it's imminent. The draft rule has been issued by SBA. I think might go into effect next year, or we might be waiting for the final rule. And I apologize that I don't have that information at the top of my head. But it's a three-year rolling average right now, going to change to a 5-year rolling average. So that's obviously going to help some companies. It's going to potentially hurt others. It's going to maybe help some on the upside and hurt them on the back end. But that 3-year window will go to a 5-year window. You then average up your 5 years of annual revenues, and you see, again, based on your NAICS code for your industry, how do you compare to the threshold? You're either going to be above it and you're large, or you're going to be below it and you're small. In addition to revenue size standards, some NAICS codes have employee headcount size standards, and you don't get a choice. It's not, which one's best for you. It's just going to be one or the other, and you'll have to look at your NAICS code and figure out which one yours is. Most are revenue based. There are some that are employee headcount based. And then there's a few other exemptions there. As I mentioned, things like banking or energy production. That's not terribly important for this group. The typical size standards we see for ourselves and our subcontractors, you see there on the right. Construction has just increased again a little bit. It's up to 39.5 million. Environmental remediation, which a lot of the others of you listening to this call might be affected by, is a headcount standard. So that's 750 employees. And then you see landfills, T&D. We'll look at a slide that has a few others here. And you can see highway, street, and bridge construction is at the 39.5 million, dredging 30 million, waste collection 41 million, et cetera, et cetera. In any event, there's an SBA website that has dozens and dozens, probably over 100 different NAICS codes from every industry, from construction to literally hairdressing, hairstyling, film production, gardening, land, just everything, right? So whatever industry you're in, if you're selling something to the government, there will be a NAICS code that tells you what your dollar threshold is, and then you'll know whether you're large or small for the work that you're doing. Okay, so once you've established whether you're large or small, then we're going to take a look at these various subcategories. And all of these subcategories will follow the same theme, which is going to be management and ownership. So for all of them, we're going to talk about, who owns the company, who's managing the company. And I think the main takeaways on this slide and the next few slides are, it has to be ownership and day-to-day active management, right? You can't have a shell company, and there are many, many people in jail today who fail to appreciate this, who think, hey, I'll just put my wife's name on the paperwork and say she's the president of my company, and that's a woman-owned small business because her name's on the stock. But if she's not actively managing the company, that is not a woman-owned business. And similarly, there are a lot of cases where people do what we call rent-a-veteran scams, where they'll go out and find some veteran and put his name as the president of the company, even though that person, never comes to the company, isn't really running the company. And then people try and get these benefits by pretending that they're veteran-owned and run. And again, there are a lot of people like that who have tried that scam and who have ended up in jail as well. So my main takeaway here is ownership and control, day-to-day control. In a lot of these cases, the SBA will come in and they will audit, they will interview, and if they feel like, hey, this person doesn't know what's going on at this company, they are not actively managing this company, this is a scam, they will indict, and they do it very frequently. So when we're talking about any of these categories, again, it's got to be management and control. So the first one here, small disadvantaged business, pretty straightforward, right? So they have to be small to begin with, and then the management and control would have to be 51% or greater minority owned. This one used to be certified by SBA. Now you can self-certify. Okay, the next one is women owned. Same thing, right? They've got to be small to begin with, and they've got to be more than 51% managed daily and owned by a female. Companies used to be able to self-certify. I think they still can, but they also have some programs that the SBA runs where there are third-party consultants who will come in and audit you and give you a formal certification, which is a little bit stronger. I will also say that if you're used to doing state work, probably every state has its own paradigm of WBE, Women Business Enterprise, or their own version of women-owned small businesses. They usually, and I'll say usually maybe 80%, kind of line up to the federal standards, but they're not always 100% the same. And the same thing applies to the small disadvantaged businesses that I just talked about. Most states will have a disadvantaged business enterprise or a minority-owned type of paradigm. And again, their rules may be similar, but rarely are they exactly the same. So just because a company comes and says, hey, I'm certified by Nebraska as minority owned, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will also qualify as an SDB under the federal rules. There's a good chance that they will, but it's not certainly automatic. And so when you're verifying subcontractors, you want to make sure that they understand what the federal standards are and that they're certifying to those standards, not necessarily those of their state. Okay, our next two categories here will be veteran-owned and service-disabled veteran-owned. This is pretty much what it sounds like. You've got to be owned and managed by a qualified veteran or owned and managed by a qualified service-disabled veteran. That's going to be somebody who was had a disability that was incurred or aggravated in the line of duty, and that they were not dishonorably discharged from the military, and they've opened their own business. Like I said, for whatever reason, VOSBs and SD-VOSBs seems to be an area where there has been I'd say a more than statistical amount of fraud, where companies who are not run by veterans go and find one and try and stick him in as the quote-unquote president so that they can get benefits under these programs. It's obviously illegal, it's unethical, but it also happens with alarming regularity because I see it in the news quite a bit. So again, we have our subcontractors certified, but they also will have their own reps and certs up on sam.gov. And if we felt like somebody was maybe misrepresenting themselves, that would be an area where we would probably refer that over to the SBA for further action. Okay, the next one is HUBZone Business Enterprise. This one's a little bit different because this is a small business, and here we're not at all focused on who owns it necessarily. A HUBZone stands for a historically underutilized business zone, and that's going to be an area of the country, whether it's a census tract or a county by county basis, or even an Indian reservation or a BRAC affected area. It's going to be a parcel of land, large or small, that's been designated by SBA as being kind of economically disadvantaged. And so to be a HUBZone business, you've got to have two criteria checked off. The first one is that your headquarters has got to be inside the HUBZone. Okay, so you'll literally plug your address into a website and you'll find out whether you qualify or you don't qualify. And then the second item is that 35% of your employees must also live in a HUBZone. So again, you have to plug all their addresses into the website and make sure that you've got that 35% met. So some industries, this is a lot easier than others. If you think about a manufacturing plant and that plant is in the HUBZone and you are recruiting heavily on your employees from around that area, it might be pretty easy for you to qualify as a HUBZone business. If you're a service provider and you do projects all over the state or all over the country, or if you have 5 or 6 different offices in different areas, then it's going to be much harder for you to qualify, because even if your headquarters is in a HUBZone, your 35% employees, the more your employees are dispersed, the harder it is for 35% of them to line up into a HUBZone. So HUBZones, as I mentioned, there are about 15,000 different HUBZones in the country. I can't tell you what they all are by any stretch of the imagination. Again, you just have to go look at the website that the SBA puts together. and it will, on an address by address, census tract by census tract basis, tell you who is qualified. So as I mentioned, it's going to be census tracts that were identified in the last census. So if you think about that, by definition, areas that are hub zones now may or may not be hub zones 2 years from now, because we're about to have the biennial census next year. And so obviously there's going to be some new data that comes out of that. Some current hub zones may fall out. Some areas that aren't currently hub zones may fall in. In addition, most but not all Indian reservations qualify as hub zones, BRAC areas, and then qualified disaster areas. So we see that from time to time. After Hurricane Katrina, for example, President Bush declared the entire Gulf Coast a hub zone. I think there was a time when Guam, the entirety of Guam was declared a hub zone. So there are special dispensations as well that get made by the government from time to time that will bring areas into or out of the hub zone program. Okay, and this next slide just kind of shows again what the hub zone map looks like. There's the URL. You can take a look at that on your own time. And then you just punch in your address and you'll see whether you fall into a census tract or a county or Indian land if you fall into a hub zone area. And this is also how you would track your employees. The next category we're going to talk about is 8A certified businesses. This is basically just named after Section 8A of the SBA, the Small Business Act. And basically what it says is for businesses that are socially and economically disadvantaged, they also have some programs where they can obtain benefits. So the first thing is, what does it mean to be socially and economically disadvantaged? So not universally, but frequently, and statistically frequently, that means that it's going to be minority owned. But there are also 8A businesses that are female owned. There are 8A businesses that are owned by persons with disabilities. And there have been some 8A businesses that are owned by persons of a certain religion. So if they can prove that, because of their social status, that they've been socially prejudiced and economically disadvantaged, in other words, they can't get opportunities to do work, they can't, get access to finance and capital, banks won't talk to them because they're of a certain group, that sort of thing, they can get eligibility into the 8A program. The 8A program allows the government to give these types of businesses sole source work. So, and it's not a freebie. They have to go in and prove that they're capable of the work. They have to, propose the work. They have to, negotiate the proper price. And they have to demonstrate that they know what they're doing. The government, above all, wants the work done. Whatever they're buying, they want the actual product, not just to be able to say, hey, we gave it to this company and they're going to go figure it out or learn on the job. So the companies have to be capable, but if they're capable, and they can convince the client that they can do the job that the client needs done, they can get sole source awards. 8A businesses basically will stay in that program for 8 years, maybe 8, maybe 9, but I'm going to say 8 is my memory. And then they have to kind of graduate out of that program. They may also graduate early if they're, more successful than they planned on being. So if their revenues grow and they're getting a lot of work, they may graduate out of that program. Similarly, if they're not trying very hard and they're not getting any competitive work and they're only relying on the government to give them sole source work, they might not make it 8 years. They might get kicked out of that program by the SBA and say, hey, you're not really trying to grow your business. You're not trying to, do the things that you need to do to be here in 10 years. You're just, seeing what we'll give you today for free without competition. And that's not what the program's intended for. It's intended to provide a runway for these companies to be able to kind of get up and going and then be able to compete in the open market. And then they basically get graduated or kicked out of the program. Okay, the next three we'll talk about will be, again, what I referred to earlier is the trifecta of companies that are eligible for Indian Incentive Act awards, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But those are going to be Alaska Native corporations and then Hawaiian and Indian. Alaska Native, again, you see this has nothing to do with the individual owner or management per se, but it's going to be a company that's owned by one of the congressionally designated list of tribal entities. So there's 12 of those up in Alaska. These companies can be very, very large. So they're not small businesses, but they still qualify for small business benefits. They can own as many 8A companies as they want. and they can have larger than the $4 million sole source set-asides. So ANCs have been through the ups and downs politically over the years. They had a tremendous number of benefits, I'd say 10, 15 years ago, and those tend to, have been trimmed back a little bit, but they still have, I would say larger thresholds and more opportunities for sole source work than most of the other categories. The second category that falls into Indian Incentive Act eligibility is NHOs, or Native Hawaiian Organizations. And again, this is going to be somebody who can prove that they're 51% or more owned and managed by Native Hawaiian. And that doesn't mean somebody who lives in Hawaii or who was born in Hawaii. It's going to be somebody who is a descendant, going back many years, evidenced by genealogical records, and they can prove that they are in fact Native Hawaiian. So there are not hundreds and thousands of Native Hawaiian businesses that have been certified. It's a much smaller number. So it's a little bit harder to find these, and certainly depending on where you're working, it's maybe near impossible. So for those of you that are listening from North Carolina, you're probably not going to find any Native Hawaiian organizations. But for those of you who are doing business with our Hawaii office, we obviously run into them a lot more. The last category here is Basic Indian Incentive Act, and this is for companies. Again, they don't have to be small, but companies that are owned and controlled by Indian-owned businesses. And again, this isn't just somebody saying, well, I did a 23andMe and I'm an Indian, so somewhere back in my genealogy, 2%, so I want to be this business. You have to be certified by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It has to be a proper recognized tribe. You have to have, again, ownership and management. You can't find an Indian and make him the figurehead of your organization. So those are kind of the categories under the Indian Incentive Act. For those three categories, ANCs, NHOs, and Indian-owned firms, under the Indian Incentive Act, basically what happens is that for every dollar you give these businesses, you can apply to your government contracting officer, and you can receive a 5% incentive payment in return. So if I give somebody, $1 million worth of subcontract work, then I would be eligible for a $50,000 incentive payment in return. And so this money doesn't come from the agency. It doesn't come from their budget. It comes directly from Congress. It's a special funding allocation. It's very popular. This fund gets tapped out every year, as shown here on this slide. So back in the early, late 90s, aughts, I think people were still finding out about the program, and it didn't used to get tapped out. And then once people kind of discovered the program, every year it gets capped out to the point that you see it gets capped out, and now Congress is kind of increasing the amount of availability. So from 08 to fiscal year 2017, it was $15 million. They spent every dollar of it every year. And then in fiscal year 18, they moved it up to 20 million, and that is also getting tapped out. So prime contractors are in tune with this, and they are, taking advantage of their subcontract work to NHOs, ANCs, and Indian-owned enterprises, and they are getting this modest but very helpful 5% rebate back from Congress. So the key things to know about this is it only applies to DoD contracts. It doesn't apply to all government work. So if you're working for the State Department or the EPA, you can kind of ignore this. But if you are working for DoD, then you should be eligible. You also need to look in your contract and make sure that the clause is there. If it's not, then you will need to request that your contracting officer put the clause into your contract in a modification. You can request the incentive pretty much anytime after you've paid the subcontractor, because that's how you can prove how much money you gave them. You can't do it before that, because obviously there could be descopes, there could be, termination for convenience, there could be anything that's happened. But once you've paid the subcontractor, you can go apply for your incentive payment. Because it does get capped out every year, I would encourage people to do it kind of sooner rather than later. And if you have a subcontractor that's going to be working for you for, more than a year or 2 years, then, you might not want to wait till the very end of their work when they're completely done, but you might want to, submit interim requests, maybe December 31st being a cutoff, and then submit them in January, And then that way you don't wait forever and ever and ever. You can kind of get some of that money moving a little bit quicker. Again, it tends to be first come, first serve. And so even if you spend the money this year, if the pool is totally tapped out, they will just roll your application to the next fiscal year. So you won't get frozen out of the program if you don't submit in time, but you might get delayed. And we've had some cases where we've applied for things and it's been 2 to 3 years before they finally came through. So the sooner you can get those applications in, the better. All right, last couple of slides we're going to talk about for other programs is the DoD MentorProtege program and the SBA MentorProtege program. These two different types of MentorProtege programs are similar, but not exactly the same. The goal of the two is the same, and that's to align large businesses who are the mentors with small businesses who are the proteges, so that the proteges can have some additional subcontracting opportunities, some training, some guidance, and some, as defined by the term, some mentoring. Under the DoD program, you can get some funding, but I will say it's not a lot. That says $5.4 billion, but that's over a 30-year period, so that's kind of a rounding error in terms of government spending. This is not a way for a prime contractor to make money. It's not a profitable program, but it is a way for a prime contractor to, both get some points on proposals, to achieve some other goals about having a small business that they can mentor and work with carefully. And then the monetary part of this is, like I said, it's not profit making, but they'll, pay you back a small portion of the money that you can prove that you spent mentoring your protege. So for example, if you provide them training and you can prove that you spent $100,000 providing them training, maybe you can get half of that back. So again, not profitable, but this program kind of helps take the bite out of the entire spend. The second type of program is the SBA MentorProtege program. This one has no funding attached to it, so you don't get anything, but it does have a lot more benefits in terms of how the mentor and the protege can kind of joint venture together to go after set-aside contracts. So under the All Small program for SBA MentorProtege, if you have a protege that's small, then you are also, in terms of being the joint venture, you guys jointly will be considered as small, and that gives the large business a window to go pursue some set-aside contracts. Now, there are requirements and restrictions. The large business can't do, 98% of that work and just say, good thing we found a small business to, let us into the party. We'll take it from here. It doesn't work like that. The small business has to primarily still be in the driver's seat and do at least a statistical majority of the work. But again, it does give, for larger projects, the large business might get the advantage of being able to get some exposure to that client, have some revenue, and also put on their resume that they mentored the small business. That helps you in your CPARs. That helps you in your proposal when you're doing your small business subfactors and you're proposing on new awards. So there are some non-monetary benefits to participating in these programs. And then lastly, but in the interest of time, I'm going to scooch past this really fast. There are a lot of other really ancillary small business programs. And I say really ancillary. It's not that these aren't important. They're just much smaller, and we tend to not run into them on a regular basis. So some of these are just for small businesses in terms of tech transfer or almost like grants for doing certain types of innovation research. You also see there's a couple categories there under NIB and NISH for opportunities for work for the disabled or the blind. We're not going to talk about those. They aren't important. We just kind of don't run into them on a quite as regular basis. Okay, so now kind of moving on to the requirements of the small business subcontracting plan. And this is really a little bit more of a focus for our subcontractors who are attending today so that they know what they have to do. FAR 52-219-8 talks about where we have to flow these down. I've already teased this information. If you are a large business doing more than $1.5 million in work for us on a construction job, you have to do everything that we have to do, which is you have to have a subcontracting plan. You have to provide us biannual data. You have to submit that data to the government website, and you have to, pursue your goals and explain in your narrative sections any goals that you haven't met. Now, the only reason you wouldn't have to do this is if you are yourself a small business. Or if you're not subcontracting anything, so if you subcontract $0, then you don't have to obviously give any of that to any of these subcategories. Or if 100% of your work is outside of the United States, and that's probably not going to apply to anybody on this call. So for each contract that you do, you have to have a plan for that contract. So if you've got 3 contracts under 3 different prime contracts, you have to have 3 different plans. If you've only got, you could have multiple task orders, but if they're under the same contract, you can roll those all up into just having one plan. Your plan will cover the entire contract period. So you'll do it year by year. And so you might say, you know, this is my annual goals. And so that way they kind of come out in the wash if you're over your goals 1 year or under your goals 1 year. You do look at them cumulatively as you go on. You report them periodically, but you also look at the total roll up. And then there's a report called an ISR. There's also a report called an SSR, your individual subcontract report and your summary subcontract report. And that is used to determine whether or not you've met those numerical quantitative goals. So in a plan, you have to have a handful of things that are mandatorily required. You can look at FAR 19704 to find out what these are. But basically, you will express your goals as a percentage of the subcontracting dollars that you intend to subcontract. So you'll list out how many dollars you think you're going to subcontract. You'll list out the types of supplies and services you think you might subcontract. You'll talk about how you develop your goals. You know, I did a market research, and it looks like there's a lot of veteran-owned businesses in this area, but there's not a lot of, for example, women-owned businesses in this area. So therefore, my goals on this dynamic are pretty high, and my goals for this dynamic might be a little bit lower than average. You'll discuss the methods that you use to identify your potential small businesses, whether that's online research, career fairs, working with consultants or counselors, other types of outreach. And then in addition to that, you'll have the name of the person administering the plan, what efforts you made to make sure that small businesses had the opportunity to bid work. You'll have a certification that you flow down the clause to your subcontractors if they are over the threshold, and you will assert and certify that you will do your biannual reporting. Okay, the ISR and SSR form looks a little bit like this. I apologize for the size. It's kind of as big as we can make it and have it be meaningful at all. Otherwise, it's just a snippet. But albeit a little bit fuzzy, what you can see down there at the bottom is you'll see small business concerns, large business concerns in total. And then at the very bottom of that form, you can see the beginning of where we start to report the subcategories. So you see small disadvantaged business, women-owned business, and then HBCUMIs, which we really haven't talked about, but that would be historically Black colleges and universities. We generally don't run into those very often. But if you did have a subcontract to an academic institution that was historically minority, you would record that data here. So this data, again, every 6 months, this data gets reported. It gets reported to us as the prime, but then it also goes into ESRS for all subcontractors who are on this call. If you, again, got a construction contract with us that's more than $1.5 million, you should be familiar with this. If you are not, we would encourage you to get familiar with it pretty quickly. ESRS.gov has a lot of training. We'll look at that on the next slide, but that will enable you to open up your account. You put in all of your company data, you put in your contract number, and then twice a year you go and submit your forms through this portal. The most recent report was due literally last week, and that would have been up through September 30th for data. Then you've got 30 days to kind of process your data and submit those reports. If for any reason you didn't do it, I would say don't stress out, but I would get on the website and try and get it done as quickly as possible. You're not going to get in trouble if it's a little bit late. You might get in trouble if you don't do it at all. So in addition to the ISRs, you've also got SSRs. Those are only due once a year, but they're basically a roll-up of all of your other ISR data. Again, this is for subcontractors. We are certainly available to answer any questions that you may have, but I would also tell you that the ASRS website can give you 10 times more training and information than I can. There are videos, there are webinars, there are a lot of fact papers and posters and everything else in the world on the site that will help educate you. There's also obviously a help desk. and there are people there that can help you, walk you through the process if you haven't been through it before. Okay, in our last few minutes before we get to questions, and if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A, and we'll go through this when we're done. This is, a little bit more for our internal ECC employees, but certainly it's maybe of general interest to everybody. We want to talk a little bit about, again, what are some of the non-quantitative benefits when you are managing a very robust and healthy small business program. You can then go get awards that recognize the efficacy of your small business program. And this is very helpful because this then feeds into your CPAR evaluation. It absolutely feeds into your proposals for small business. That's always a sub-factor that's going to be scored. It helps with client recognition. I mean, it just helps around the board. So in our history, we've had a lot of awards. It's something that we've fallen out of a little bit in recent years, but that we're going to start paying more attention to and get back into the award cycle here shortly. But there's one award called the Dwight D. Eisenhower Award, which is basically the best large business in the country in terms of prime contractor excellence for their small business subcontractor plans. We were able to win that award twice. We also won the Francis Perkins Award, which they don't give out anymore, but that was for excellence for women-owned small business subcontracting. So really targeted efforts for women-owned small business. There are also awards for targeted efforts for service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. We've won that once. Again, this is the nationwide #1 contractor within our industry for SD-VOSB subcontracting. And then we won a variety of smaller awards through SAMI and regional entities. So like I mentioned, it's a very big effort of focus for us right now. Those of you, some of you may have attended the industry day we did in North Carolina earlier this year, but we are doing a lot more outreach than we have in maybe the last couple of years, with an eye towards increasing the number of small business bidders, which then statistically will increase the number of small business subcontractors, and then by definition increase our data, make our reporting look better, and make us, again, more eligible for some of these awards, recognition, and positive benefits on CPARs and proposals. So in review, the benefits of a successful program, I mean, first of all, it's compliance, right? So nobody necessarily does this because they have a lot of free time and it's fun, but you do it because it's required under the FAR and you have to do it. But that said, you can do the minimum required and check the box, or you can put a little bit more effort to it and actually try and achieve a benefit out of it other than strict low-side compliance. I think it does help in improve visibility in industry. It helps with recruiting employees. It also helps with getting the attention of qualified small businesses to you. I've mentioned several times it helps with CPAR ratings and evaluations, and it basically an overall reputational benefits and improved client satisfaction. What do we normally look at? This slide may be a little bit out of order, but let me kind of back into it. The first category there shows kind of, what are the typical DoD goals, and then you can kind of see how we roll out after that. Our goals tend to be higher than DoD goals. Frankly, DoD expects our goals to be higher, in some cases, twice as high. And then if you look at our results tend to be higher than our goals. Although as I did point out, it kind of depends on the program. There are certain cases where you may have, much higher performance in certain categories and, below average performance in other categories. And that's sometimes just a matter of programs getting off the ground, right? So you might not have 1,000 subcontracts where this data will average out, but instead you may have a dozen subcontracts, so you're really hitting some targets hard, and other targets you just haven't gotten there yet. So if you look at our goals for WOSBs, we're ahead of goal, and our target for HUBZone, we're at 600%, right? So that looks great, but then conversely, if you look at small disadvantaged business, we're about halfway where we need to be, and we've really gotten out of the gates a little slow on VOSB and SD-VOSB, although I think we've got some plans in place to make those numbers look better for 2020 and moving forward. So Training and awareness. I mean, these rules should be familiar to your estimators because this is where small businesses get selected or, first identified to go into the funnel. These rules should be familiar to your project managers and program managers. They're the ones picking the businesses. They need to know that it's important, to find the businesses that fit into these categories. If you only go out to large businesses and only pick the low price of those large businesses, you may succeed on one dynamic, but you're going to have zeros on your small business, and that's not a good thing. These rules should be familiar to your business development people who are identifying subs and teaming partners and joint venture partners in the early stages. And these rules should also be very familiar to all of these personnel that work for our large business subcontractors, because they have to do all of the things that we just described. All right, so how can you generate small business interest and increase your pool of qualified small businesses? You can check in sam.gov as one way to search. I prefer the SBA Dynamic Search website, and that link is there. It has 100 different permutations and ways to search, by county, by type of work. Do you specifically want a woman-owned business in Onslow County that does fencing? I can do that targeted of a search and see who turns up. Or I can just say, show me every minority-owned business in the entire state of Nebraska. Or, you can just search it 100 different ways. You can also contact the base or the location where you're working, ask them for references. What small businesses are they aware of? Because as we mentioned, the government gives sole source awards to certain types of small businesses. So in theory, they should know some, and they can kind of tell us who the local qualified, successful, reputable small businesses are. In addition, we keep our own ratings in line that tell us, based on subcontractors that we've used before, who might be good, who's falls into what category, and what has our experience been with them in the past. And then finally, consider, depending on the size of your project or your office, doing a small business industry day or an opportunity fair. We've done a handful of them over the years, from Guam to Hawaii, all the way to North Carolina and everywhere in between. And those tend to bring out a lot of small businesses, generate a lot of interest, and increase the bidder pool accordingly. All right. So of the things I just mentioned, this is the Small Business Administration search engine that I just talked about. It's kind of small, but you can kind of see there's like I said, literally, probably 15 or maybe 24 different ways to stratify the data and search for qualified bidders. In addition, you should also look at the local community. This slide is kind of specific to North Carolina, just because that's where we've got a handful of procurement actions going on right now. But every community will have a similar list of community entities that will help you find small businesses. And then also you can look at outreach opportunities. These are nationwide. This is just a smattering of the ones that we participated in the last 12 months. Again, that's just all part of having a dynamic, active, engaged small business program. So quick review questions here, and then I'll go to your guys' questions. Please type those in if you haven't already, if you have them. What are socioeconomic clauses? Again, these are clauses that are designed to provide opportunities and openings into the government acquisition market for businesses that otherwise might not have those opportunities. So that can be businesses that are located in a certain area or businesses that are owned by a certain type of individual. So 5 types of socioeconomic business designations. We talked in this hour about a lot more than 5, but this is kind of our alphabet soup, right? Small, disadvantaged business, women-owned business, service disabled veteran, regular veteran, 8As, hub zones, Native Hawaiians, etc. The third review question, can the government waive competition for socioeconomic reasons? We talked about that yes, they can. They can sole source work to hub zones, and they can sole source work to ANCs, and they can sole source work to 8As. And in addition, they can also do limited competition, competitive set-asides for small businesses. So the government has a lot of tools in their tool belt in terms of being able to move business or move opportunities, at least, to small businesses. Fourth question here for review, can ECC waive competition for socioeconomic reasons? And the answer here is that no, we cannot. So the things that I mentioned the government can do are within the government's purview, but as a subcontractor to the government, we can't then look and say, well, this guy's an 8A, we're just going to go give him all the work for free without competing that work. The fifth box there, which designation or programs can help you improve your bottom line? We talked a lot about non-quantitative benefits, improve CPARs, improve proposals, reputational issues, client satisfaction. But in addition to that, there are some programs that have quantitative benefits, and those would include, obviously, the Indian Incentive Act, which has a 5% incentive payment, as well as potentially the mentor-protege programs, which will help get you into markets or acquisition opportunities that you might not otherwise be able to be involved with. And then finally, true or false, ECC can receive sole source awards if it has a qualified AA subcontractor, and that's kind of a goofy question, but it's false. Okay, so a handful of resources here. If you check the slides or the webinar after the fact, you can kind of pause on this. I won't leave it up long enough for everybody to write everybody's name down, but there are a host of people within ECC who can help answer your questions or get your question funneled to me. And then finally, I'll just give a little preview before we move to questions. Our past subcontractor compliance webinars are at the following locations on ECC's YouTube channel. So if you've missed one, or even if you attended but forgot some stuff that you want to go check, all of that content is there. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, December 12th. That's 5 weeks from today. Same time, 3:30 Eastern. We will send out the link to that broadcast as well. In addition, if you would like a copy of the slides for this broadcast or a link to the YouTube once we have it posted, again, please go to the Q&A and give us your name, company name, and email. And we will get that information out to you. Okay, so most of the questions I see here are just asking for the slides. And that's almost all of the questions this week are just asking for the slides. So I don't see anything that's particularly substantive. I see a couple of questions that are actually so specific that I'm not going to delve into them here. I'm going to contact the requesters offline. Because one of these has a 5-minute answer and the other one, I literally would have to go research it before I could answer it. So I think with that, we're right at about an hour, so we're going to close this down. Again, I will leave the Q&A open for another 10 minutes. If you need the slides, please give us your name and number. If you have questions, go ahead and submit them and I'll answer them offline. And I hope to see you all on December 12th. The topic will be ethics and compliance, and that'll be our last webinar for 2019. Thank you for your time, and look forward to talking to you next month.